A heavy silence hung over Myrtles Plantation as Sarah and Michael Jenkins stepped out of their car, the ancient house looming before them like a dark, sleeping giant. The air was thick with an almost tangible tension, the kind that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck prickle. She glanced at the long rows of windows, each one like a watchful eye, and for a fleeting moment, she could have sworn she saw a shadow pass by. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but something deep in her gut told her this was more than just another weekend getaway. They had come for the thrill of it, the allure of staying in one of America's most haunted homes, expecting creaky floors and spooky stories to share with friends. But as they crossed the threshold into the dimly lit foyer, the temperature seemed to drop, and a faint, sweet scent of jasmine filled the air, accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of being watched. In the uneasy quiet that followed, Sarah's heart began to pound, and she realized with a sinking feeling that they were not alone. The spirits of Myrtles Plantation had awakened, and they had been expecting company.
It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Sarah and Michael Jenkins pulled up to the grand entrance of Myrtles Plantation. The sprawling estate, covered in a veil of mist, looked every bit as eerie as the stories they had heard. They had decided to stay for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the monotony of city life. As they stepped out of their car, the creak of the iron gates behind them sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She shook it off, attributing it to excitement. The couple was greeted by Mrs. Beauregard, the elderly caretaker, who had a presence as formidable as the mansion itself. She offered them a polite, if somewhat distant, smile. "Welcome to Myrtles Plantation," she said, her voice almost swallowed by the vastness of the surrounding woods. "Your room is ready, and dinner will be served at 7. Please, make yourselves at home." As they walked through the grand foyer, Sarah couldn't help but notice the opulent but dated decor. The chandelier overhead twinkled like hundreds of little eyes watching them. Michael, always the skeptic, chuckled. "Looks like something out of a horror movie, doesn't it?" he joked, nudging Sarah. She forced a smile, her gaze lingering on an old portrait of a young girl with piercing eyes. Something about the painting unnerved her. Their room was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor. The moment they stepped inside, the air felt heavier. The four-poster bed, adorned with intricate lace, seemed almost too large for the space. A sudden cold draft swept through the room, and the door closed with a soft thud. "Probably just the wind," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. As Sarah unpacked, she thought she heard faint footsteps outside their door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the dim wall sconces. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the sense of unease settling in her chest. "This place is just old and creaky," she told herself, but a lingering feeling told her there was more to it than that. That night, as they sat down for dinner, Mrs. Beauregard joined them. Her presence was both comforting and unsettling. "Have you heard the history of Myrtles?" she asked, her voice low and conspiratorial. Sarah leaned forward, curious despite herself. "A bit. Something about hauntings?" she ventured. Mrs. Beauregard's eyes darkened. "Oh, it's much more than that," she whispered. "This place has secrets that don't like to stay hidden." The wind howled outside their window as Sarah and Michael settled into bed. The plantation seemed to creak and groan with each gust, as if it were alive and restless. Michael, exhausted from the day's journey, fell asleep almost instantly. But Sarah lay awake, listening to the unsettling sounds that seemed to seep through the walls. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. It was well past midnight when she heard the faint sound of crying. At first, she thought it was a dream, but the soft, mournful sobbing grew louder. She sat up, her heart racing. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway outside their room. She nudged Michael, but he merely mumbled something incoherent and rolled over. Summoning her courage, Sarah slipped out of bed and quietly opened the door. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering sconce, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The sobbing was clearer now, echoing down the corridor. It led her to the portrait of the young girl she had seen earlier. To her horror, the girl in the painting seemed different, as if her eyes were following Sarah's every move. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate. It was as if it were coming from the portrait itself. Sarah stumbled back, her breath coming in quick gasps. She turned and nearly screamed as she came face to face with Mrs. Beauregard. The old woman's face was eerily calm, her eyes knowing. "You heard her, didn't you?" she asked softly. "Who?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Beauregard sighed, her gaze drifting to the portrait. "Chloe, she was a slave girl who lived here centuries ago, wronged and vengeful. Some say she still wanders these halls, seeking justice for her untimely death." Shaken, Sarah returned to their room, her mind racing. She tried to tell Michael, but he brushed it off. "It's just your imagination," he said sleepily. "This place is old and creepy. It's playing tricks on you." But Sarah knew what she had heard. As she lay back down, the crying had stopped, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The next morning, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. Mrs. Beauregard's words echoed in her mind. Over breakfast, she tried to bring it up again with Michael, but he seemed more interested in exploring the grounds. "We didn't come all this way to be scared off by ghost stories," he said with a laugh. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed to join in. As they wandered through the estate, the sun shone brightly, casting an almost cheerful light over the grounds. But even in daylight, the shadows seemed to cling to the house, and Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching them from the dark windows. When they reached the old oak tree in the backyard, Mrs. Beauregard's voice seemed to whisper in her ear. Chloe was hanged from that very tree. By the third day, the atmosphere at Myrtles Plantation had shifted from eerie to oppressive. The air seemed thicker, and shadows lingered in corners where they didn't belong. Sarah felt an almost palpable sense of dread every time she passed the portrait of Chloe. The girl's eyes seemed to grow darker, more accusing, as if she knew something Sarah didn't. That afternoon, while Michael was taking a nap, Sarah wandered into the library. She found Mrs. Beauregard there, dusting off old books. "You seem troubled, dear," the caretaker said without looking up. Sarah hesitated before blurting out, "What really happened to Chloe?" Mrs. Beauregard stopped dusting and looked at her, eyes sharp and piercing. She was a housemaid who was caught eavesdropping on the family's private matters, Mrs. Beauregard said slowly. As punishment, they cut off her ear. In retaliation, she poisoned the family's children, but it went too far, and they died. Chloe was hanged from the oak tree and has been haunting this place ever since. She paused, her gaze drifting to the darkened corners of the room. "She's restless, seeking revenge, perhaps forgiveness." A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine. She suddenly felt the urge to leave, to escape this place that seemed to close in on her. But as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own. Sarah froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Mrs. Beauregard didn't seem surprised. "She doesn't like it when people dig too deep," she murmured. "Be careful, child, the spirits here are not kind." That evening, the atmosphere at dinner was tense. The lights flickered, and the air was filled with a sense of anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Michael tried to lighten the mood, but Sarah was too unnerved to respond. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Chloe's ghostly form lurking in the shadows. As they retired to their room, Sarah's anxiety reached a breaking point. She could feel eyes on her, could sense something dark and malevolent lurking just out of sight. The room felt colder than usual, and she noticed a mist forming near the window. "Michael," she whispered, shaking his arm, "do you see that?" But before he could respond, the mist coalesced into a vague human shape. Michael sat up, his face pale. "What the hell?" he muttered. The shape moved towards them, and as it did, the room seemed to close in, the walls pressing down on them. Sarah could barely breathe as the figure reached out a ghostly hand. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving behind an icy chill and a lingering sense of dread. "We need to leave," Sarah gasped, her heart racing. Michael, still shaken, nodded. "First thing in the morning," he agreed. But deep down, Sarah knew that leaving wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. Myrtles Plantation had a way of holding onto its guests, and she wasn't sure it was ready to let them go. As dawn broke, a loud crash jolted Sarah and Michael from their uneasy sleep. Heart pounding, they rushed down the stairs, following the sound to the library. Books lay strewn across the floor, and in the center of the chaos stood a small wooden box, ominously glowing. Mrs. Beauregard appeared, her expression grave. "You shouldn't be here," she warned. "That box holds Chloe's spirit." Before they could react, the air chilled, and Chloe's ghostly form materialized, sorrow etched on her face. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, reaching for them. Terrified, Sarah instinctively picked up the box, feeling its weight of history. She held it out to Chloe, who took it with trembling hands. In that instant, a blinding light filled the room, and the oppressive darkness lifted. As the light faded, Chloe was gone, and the air felt lighter. Mrs. Beauregard exhaled, relief washing over her. "You set her free." They left Myrtles Plantation that morning, the weight of fear replaced by a strange peace. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back, catching a glimpse of a girl with sad eyes standing on the porch, perhaps finally at rest.